Welcome to the Businesstalk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Elisa Operti, Professor of Strategy at ESSEC Business School, France, as our distinguished guest on Businesstalk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Professor Elisa earned her PhD in management from Bocconi University and later completed a postdoctoral fellowship at UCA Lugano. Her research explores how social networks influence behavior and innovation across individual, organizational, and regional levels. She has a special interest in understanding how positive and negative network ties interact and how multi-level network dynamics shape outcomes. Her work has appeared in leading academic journals such as Academy of Management Journal, Organization Science, Strategic Management Journal, and Journal of Management. Dr. Opereti's research has been supported by prestigious institutions including the French National Research Agency, the Paris Scene Initiative, and the Swiss National Foundation. At ESSEC Business School, she teaches courses on strategy and network analysis across master's, executive, and PhD programs. Before entering academia, she gained professional experience at JP Morgan Chase in London, UK. In today's episode, Professor Elisa shares key insights from her prominent research, recessions, institutions, and regional exploration. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elisa Operti to the conversation. Professor Elisa, it is a distinct privilege to welcome you to Businesstalk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure for me to be with you and share my research.
Thank you. Professor, to begin, what core puzzle or gap in the innovation literature motivated you to undertake this study?
Okay, this is quite a different study because it doesn't have a network component and most of my research is network related. What really made us puzzled was an apparent contradiction, a paradox. We know that during recessions, we always associate negative consequences to recessions. So firms cutting their credits, demand fall, people being cautious in taking risk, layoffs. So bad economy, less innovation. However, when we look at the history, the 1929 recession was one of the periods that then started a wave of breakthrough innovations and inventions. Think about synthetic material like nylon, radar, sensing, jet propulsion. All of these great new inventions came out right after the recession, or the research started around that. So we said maybe the right question to ask is not, does innovation go up or down during recessions? But the question may be, what kind of innovations people pursue during recession? Is it different from the regular innovation that we pursue on a daily basis? And also, a lot of what we know about recessions is about firms, like firms starting recession, firms suffering for recessions, or about individuals. But then recessions are really something that hits communities, regions. So we wanted to explore this at the level of the community, the ecosystem, the region. When a shock like a recession happens, what kind of innovation do a region or an ecosystem pursue or prioritize? And this was to try to solve this puzzle. Is innovation going to be negatively or positively affected, or does recession change the nature of innovation?
Professor, your paper uses a specific theoretical lens to examine innovation dynamics. How does this perspective differ from more traditional views in this field?
I think in this particular case, we bridge two different theoretical traditions. So we depart a bit from the traditional view of innovation, seeing innovation as an investment decision, that when you have resources to allocate, you invest more, and when the economy is weak, you invest less. But we embrace what is the evolutionary view of innovation, or the Schumpeterian view of innovation. And Schumpeter used to see recessions or crises as a land of opportunities, periods of creative distractions where basically all of the factors that were a hindrance of some radical projects would be challenged, and maybe you can really create new things. And this is kind of also common in other work of the evolutionary tradition, like Freeman was in this tradition. And also we bring in institutional perspective, because we know that institutions matter for this large-scale innovation projects. You cannot, like, it's not an inventory in a garage, maybe having an idea, but then to scale it, you need a system that favors it. And so there's research on universities, on public R&D, the state needs to invest, and also on private investors and credit and lending, and how all of these elements can provide funds and scale innovation. And so much of this research, again, knows and tells us a lot about how they function and how they promote innovation in regular periods. But we wanted to understand what's the best configuration of these institutional actors to support innovative actors during recessions. So it's really the intersection of evolutionary views of innovation, Schumpeterian views, and institution-based views of innovation that come together in this paper.
Professor, could you walk us through the research design, data, methods, and key measures, and explain why this combination was particularly suitable for your question?
Yeah. So in this project, and I forgot to say at the beginning, it's a project with Amit Kumar that is my co-author and is a professor at Warwick Business School. We wanted to study innovations that materialize into patents, because we feel that that's what is then protected and it has passed the innovation and novelty bar and usefulness bar that innovation has. And we set the study in the US recession in 2008. So we have a sample that is 7 years before the crisis and 7 years afterwards. So have the complete window around the 2008 financial crisis triggered by the Lehman situation. And the idea was really to use patent data to detect the innovation trajectories in regions, which the key measures would be that we want to spot those cases where a region started to produce patents in a completely different technology areas where they have not been active before. Imagine that a region was stably patenting in medical devices or healthcare and all of that, and all of a sudden starts to patent like in energy storage or in batteries or in renewable energies. That is for us an instance of exploration. Not just doing a high quality patent, but really doing something that before in that ecosystem people were not really exploring, not really comfortable with, and they start doing new things that are not a specialty, not an expertise of the region yet. And we measure recession using the housing price index at the metropolitan level. So we study innovation in communities, and we use the average price of houses in the metropolitan area. And the reason is that, the Great Recession was basically originating in the mortgage market, right? So the first signs, even before it reached the industry, were in the housing market, that the lending was not, the mortgages were not there to allow people to buy houses. And so prices, the bubbles were bursting, and the price houses were dropping quite significantly. And then we have various institutional variables. We collected data from the federal and the states to see how much public R&D existed in each of these ecosystems. We studied the investments in R&D by the universities that are hosted in the ecosystem. And also we studied what kinds of banks exist in the ecosystem and they can provide funding for innovation. So are they small local lending banks? Are they international banks? Are they just or mostly online banks? And the population and how much traffic, basically how much spending they manage across the whole population. So it's mostly based on archival data, and we pulled data on innovation, exploration, and crisis, but also institutional factors at the city level. So we have a sample of cities, metropolitan statistical areas in the United States, and the key crisis we study is the 2008 financial crisis.
Professor, among your empirical results, which findings surprised you the most, and why did it challenge your initial expectations?
Okay, when we came into this research, we had a pretty clear idea of the main effect we would find. No, the fact that crisis can be a place where you rediscuss your strategy and you come up with maybe new ideas. And we trusted like the Schumpeterian prediction on this. But on the institutional factors, my co-author and I were really sure that it was public spending or universities driving this, that what we consider the good guys, right? Those that invest for the community. And especially when you come to the 2008 financial crisis, well, that's not like the banks in that crisis are not the charming protagonists, you know, they are like often seen as those that caused, with the mortgages, that caused the crisis, right? Their reckless behavior in somewhat. And instead, what we find, and I think it's the most surprising results, is that when a region, when an ecosystem has a predominance of large international bank in the regional banking system that support the innovation, these were the regions that explored the most. Because it seems that the crisis also functioned to wash out maybe bad banks whose behavior and investment wasn't like supporting the ecosystem, but those that remained were working internationally across borders. They have this view international of what technologies are there, what could work. They can possibly invest in the better projects, those that have more aspiration, those that have more likelihood of success. They are very robust because operating internationally shadows them from crisis in the banking system of one country because they can compensate with another country. And so they provided a solid ground for exploration in some of the regions to grow, and for some maybe risky projects that university didn't pick up or the state didn't pick up, but they funded. And so, I mean, the fact that in that financial crisis, the banks are not only the one to blame, but the good banks, or like those that are skilled in giving credit to risk-taking actors that have done the due diligence and produce very forward-looking technology projects, is a bit the two sides of the coin, right? Some banks created this, but other banks allowed system to resist the crisis and also prosper and generate new technologies. Our expectation was more that public and university R&D would be the ones that explain, and they do an important role, actually, no? So what we find is that basically universities are always, not only in recession, always associated with exploration. And so what we find is that during recession, they have problems, right? They have lower enrollments, they have their budget is cut, so they cannot do more than what they do usually. And the public R&D, for instance, increases during recession. So it's true, the state invests, but they invest to cover up for jobs, they invest in easy employment breeding kind of projects, not really in risky projects. So the idea that the banks can be a positive force in systems like that, at least for what we find in our study, was perhaps the most intriguing institutional result.
Professor, your study shared slides on mechanism operating at multiple levels, such as individuals, firms, or ecosystems. How do this level interact in shaping innovation outcomes?
So I feel like our study is one of the few that takes this system level perspective on and community or city level perspective on recessions. We know way more about individual take risk or suffer through recessions, and also how firms manage that. But typically innovation requires an ecosystem, right? To realize it's not only the inventor having, again, his eureka moments in a garage, when it has to turn into a new technology trajectory that the region builds on. If a region has to exit given technology, let's say fossil fuel, and enter renewable energies and significantly produce, and this is like one of the redirection, for instance, that we observe in many of the cities in the United States, that they actually start to produce significantly renewable energy patents. This is really an ecosystem problem. You can't have electric mobility, you can have more sustainable energy if you don't change the system. So looking at this from this perspective, that such large transitions, can emerge during recessions. You would expect during recession, everything stops, and instead you take a chance to make a risky move. And second, thinking systematically, how can we enable the local project owner, the local inventor, through funding, through public R&D, through state, to bring that project to a level that it opens a trajectory and then the whole region can build on this trajectory. So I think our study is more macro, but it studies how these macro conditions can enable risk-taking individual to carry their project to the extent that they become new possibilities for the communities and for the regions where they live.
Professor, what are the most important practical implications of your findings for managers who are trying to foster innovation in their organizations?
Yeah, so I think, in general, when you discuss with managers, it happened, this paper went through the review process when we had the COVID crisis. So I was in the classroom, not even in the classroom, I was on Zoom with doing my usual executive education specialized master. And the concern was really about like cost cutting and how we can cut to the bone or maintain the minimum employment to survive, because the threat, the way they were seeing this was really either we cut but we keep being alive, or we die. And I think what this study says is that maybe cutting is not the only way. Maybe cutting is also can be justified, but you need to retain some exploratory projects. Also, because during recession, the landscape is completely different. So you are more able to think out of the box. And that little exploratory project can become very important in the future, can be a revenue generating. So to see recessions not just as something they have to tackle defensively, but where they can see more proactive in going through recessions and thinking about, okay, for the next months, these processes will not run as we expect, but maybe that's an opportunity to free ourselves from some of the rigidities or the old ways of seeing the relationship in our production system and come up with new ways, and maybe start one or two exploratory projects that then will leverage and grow once the recession is over. So only thinking about saving money or cutting during recessions may not be maybe giving short-term survival, but in the long run, there will be firms that have taken some risk and they will be greater. And this is very consistent. So if one looks at the studies by Flammer and Ioannou, they also find that firms that during recessions invest in R&D or in long-term sustainability projects may be more likely in the long run to recover quickly because of these getting out of the old system, or of also all the constraints, and being able to project themselves into a future in a radically different way. I think yes. And I think the question that I would say to managers is like, okay, during bad times, the opportunity cost of experimenting may be very small. If you have the demand fall, you may have engineers that are idle or that are put on a rest, or maybe in some firms that are under. But the idea is like how to leverage their creativity to think about, okay, which emerging technologies or what will happen as soon as the crisis is over, like in COVID. What will happen? People will want to travel. People will need to connect in a different way. And maybe let's use those resources that are idle because there is no demand or because there is no capital factors of production to tell them, okay, think about what could be the next big thing. And even if it won't pay immediately, even if we won't have a project right now, but use this, let's say, period where demand is not peaking, where we are not stressed, to think and to reconsider the big picture. And maybe, this is where managers can see an opportunity or the positive side of recessions.
Focus in the paper you discuss boundary conditions and limitations. Which of these do you think opens the most promising avenue for future research?
Yeah, so as I said, like we were very surprised about the result related to banking because this was a recession that was also inherently related to, financial crisis and banks. And so we thought, okay, if we study the same thing now, would these results take place or be the same if we study other types of recessions, right? Say a recession that is more like induced by a war, or a recession that is more induced by a pandemic that has no relationship with the actual systems of production and economic conditions. And so I think one avenue for replicating this study is studying different types of crisis and seeing if these relations, especially the institutional channel, is the institutional channels of banking being an important vehicle for promoting exploration through recessions. I think we should understand if this is specific to the financial crisis or in other crises, maybe like if it's a pandemic, what we were speculating with my colleague is that it might be that the public channels play a major role there, or maybe not. Like that's maybe something we would want to work on. So does the source of the shock or the type of the shock determine the relationship between the crisis and exploration? I think another thing that we have a caveat is that we look at patented innovations, so something that really materialize into patent data. But then we work like if you look at the 1929 crisis going back, it was also the birth of many artistic movements in painting, in music, etc. So the idea would be also to see how do crises affect other cultural contexts and innovation in other creative contexts, and in particular in contexts where innovation is more of an individual endeavor, right? Because if you think about like art or music, it's mostly the creator, and then you need the funding system around, but maybe you need less complementary assets, machines, investment, etc. So maybe you need a different type of institutions to support that. And so in particular, we were thinking about maybe more having case longitudinal sectors, and my colleague Stoyan Skurev has done sort of amazing studies of art history movements and their birth, and then seeing how the recession and the conditions where the individuals rooted in the movement, so seeing the conditions where economic conditions that the movement experienced at the start, how it affects the artistic directions. So seeing all the kinds of innovations that are not purely patented and exploited, and seeing, maybe ecosystems matter less in that context, maybe more. These were the lines of thought that we had in mind.
Professor, how might your result inform public policy or regional initiatives that aim to stimulate innovation and entrepreneurial activity?
Mhm. So, from a policy standpoint, you never want to be a prime minister during a period when there is a crisis, right? Or a recession, because you know that unemployment is going to go up, all firms are going to ask for support, I think when you are there, you face resource constraints. Know that it's going to be costly and painful, and you have not enough resources. And so the question is often, where can I reinforce? What can I do to improve the way people go through recessions? Can I reinforce the existing technology path of a region? Or can I build a new one? And in general, what we observe is that public support automatically goes more into the supporting the old one, right? Sustaining employment in the industries that already exist, giving tax credits to companies that do not cut their employment in mature industries. They typically sustain more mature industries, and they go to this kind of shovel-ready projects that would keep the money in the territory, maintain employment, which is great. But at the same time, you should sometimes ask yourself the question like, am I locking my region into a trajectory that is promising or that is dying anyway? Because we may all have realized that even if we fight hard to keep the existing technologies, in the long run, they're not going to be the main technology, right? And so we can support the survival of these industries, the employment, but we can also support the transformation. If a new option is open, maybe opening slowly a bit to a few selected high risk, high return projects, as banks do, would be better for policymakers. And in that respect, if they align the perspective with banking, you would have two institutions that work hand in hand to change the trajectory of the region. Of course, from a policymaking perspective, it's not easy because they have a term that is generally in the next election that is in 3-4 years. Whereas if you invest for the future, maybe the full realization of the ecosystem will come in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. So it's difficult. But at the same time, you would know that you leave a legacy that is much more important. So yes, say you're a policymaker, you face a crisis. You, of course, maintain the manufacturing regions, capabilities of a region, etc. But maybe, support one emerging sector that you know is going to be the future, clean technologies, medical devices, computing, even agri-tech. Not all innovations need to be high-tech, right? And it's not like indiscriminately copy the Silicon Valley model that, now we don't even know if it works in Silicon Valley there. But it's to see, okay, is the trajectory where the region is on going to survive the crisis and be viable for the next 10, 20 years for our sons? Or maybe let's take this opportunity to make a bit more high risk speculative investment on alternative technologies so that we plant the seeds during the crisis, and when the economic conditions will be restored, there's an opportunity for also other economic actors, investors, to come in and grow these seeds. So I feel that is, in terms of policy, the recommendation that comes from our study.
Professor,
I
if you
think
had to,
also,
yeah,
oh, sorry. I think
please go
also
ahead.
in terms of, okay, I start again. I think another implication is that in general, we think about regional innovation as given by the public actors, universities, incubators, public R&D. The importance of the banks that we highlight is also policy important because policy also regulates banks. So, of course, the 2008 crisis tells us the lesson is not let banks do all they want, right? It didn't work in 2001, it doesn't work now. But it's like, be careful in not treating them as a bad actor in general with policy measures, right? The idea is like, think about banks as collaborators and think about what is the best way to build a healthy financial system that reinforcing the public investments maintains integrity and accountability. So you work together on solving an ecosystem problem. It's not because some actors behaved in a non-reliable way that you have to close that channel. It's important to maintain it, and it's important especially to maintain it when you have these international players that have a bigger view and that can tell you what's coming in the next 5 years, 10 years, and they can do investment in new technologies.
Professor, if you had to translate one key insight from this research into a simple, actionable principle for practitioners, what would it be?
Okay, I think it would be, do not waste a crisis by only protecting the past by only focusing on the past. Think about a crisis as something that projects you in the future, right? And yeah, so rather than thinking like, where should we cut? Think about what can we learn now? What can we experiment now that before we couldn't learn because we were too busy with short-term demand or too comfortable because the economy was going well, so it wasn't pushing us towards more risky choices. And learning how to maybe take a bit of discomfort um, as an opportunity to create, to invest in more risky projects.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what is the next big research question that this study has raised for you personally? And how are you planning to explore it?
Yes, so it's a nice story because this is part of a larger project that had the two components, and this one has gone a bit faster than the other one. The other question we want to explore is how does the social fabric or the social network of innovation change during recession? What happens to these networks? Because the idea we have is not only that it changes the nature of innovation, but because you have to do different projects, you would also change the way you collaborate with others. Your network also change. We know that, for instance, we observed in some of the firms that we study that there are layoffs. So you stop collaborating with old people. Sometimes you are more constrained locally. So you cut your collaborations abroad, but you become more horizontal and more collaborative in your own office to keep everyone engaged. We also found that, for instance, in periods when people are exiting from firms at very high rate, the traditional hierarchy that is the basis of the firm is challenged because your boss may be fired before you because it costs more to the organization. And so, in particular, what we observe is that there's a process of network democratization. So people start to collaborate not with the offices in other countries because funding in other countries may be cut, not with their old top scientists because again the highest salaries may be the ones that are more challenged, but they start to collaborate locally and they start to really mobilize together to face the crisis. And when it happens repeatedly, what happens is that you have a network that is more flat. And in general, we know as network researchers that flatter network with pockets of expertise, of different expertise, you end up having to collaborate not with the top specialist in your area, but with your neighbor that works on another technology and is maybe as middle career or as junior as you are. And you create the conditions for being creative because you all see the same problem from different perspective and you're forced to collaborate because all of a sudden the collaboration with the other subsidiary is cut and some opportunities are cut. So we want to understand what is the social network mechanism that allows exploration during recessions. And so this is like, I think the next phase of the project is to see how recessions change the social fabric. And we want to study this in this context, but also in COVID, because COVID was also during the COVID transition, the COVID recession, we also had social distanciation. So we would expect that people would collaborate less, but at the same time, it was a period of bonding because we all felt challenged on core values and, far away from our families. So for some, they recasted their life about keeping in contact with the neighbor, with the work colleague. And so we're really interested to see how these shocks shape not only the outcome of innovation, but the process and the network. And if this can be one explanation why we observe more exploration, the fact that you break the traditional collaboration, co-authorship ties, which work, but maybe are a bit boring because you've been in the same position for years and years, and you start changing the people you work with, you may have more junior, you have a bit less hierarchy, and that triggers create the conditions under which new ideas emerge. So that's basically where this project is going.
Thank you, Professor Elisa, for sharing your research insights and for this engaging conversation today. We truly appreciate your time and perspectives, and we look forward to learning more from your work in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.